Recently, I found out that if I had a $10 million budget for one episode of TV, I could make an episode of Friends, an episode of Game of Thrones, or an episode of Succession. Yes, that's right. It costs the same amount of money to make Friends, Game of Thrones, and Succession. How is that even possible? Of course, it's $10 million per episode at very specific points of each series. I am well aware that it costs way more than $10 million per episode for the last season of Game of Thrones. I'm specifically talking about Season 3 of Succession, Season 6 and 7 of Game of Thrones, and Season 9 and 10 of Friends. But I was pretty surprised that the same budget was used for these three very different shows. And the more I thought about it, the less I felt like I truly understood how much $10 million really gets you. I know it's a lot of money, but it's hard to actually visualize and quantify just how much $10 million actually means. At some point, big numbers are just big. In fact, they're too big for our human brains to properly understand. This is something that neuroscientists have studied, and they have found that our brains can do all sorts of crazy mathematical somersaults. Okay, maybe not mine. But our brains are not good at comprehending big numbers. The reason for that is because our brains are built to compare and not count. Our brains are wired to recognize small amounts because that's usually the amount that we encounter every day. Anything more than 5 is harder for our brains to visually recognize, which is when we resort to counting. But at some point, when the numbers are too big, counting is just impossible. We then resort to a different way of thinking about the amount in front of us, instead using abstraction techniques rather than actually understanding what that amount actually is. That's why it's confusing why these three very different shows cost the same amount, because our brains know $10 million is a lot abstractly, but we don't actually know how to quantify the amount specifically. So, leaning into how our brains are wired to compare and not count, I tried making sense of $10 million per episode by comparing how the three shows each use their budget. First up, let's talk cast. Friends, like the other two shows, has an ensemble cast. Over time, the main 6 cast members had become such big household names that they were each earning $1 million per episode. And this was also before current levels of inflation. What a big paycheck. So, 1 million times 6, and you've already got more than half of the episode's budget. Meanwhile, pre-season 8 Game of Thrones, Emilia Clarke and Kit Harington were paid $500,000 per episode, before moving up to $1.2 million per episode in the final season. The salaries of the cast don't get us to the $10 million per episode, but I mean, when you factor in the CGI and the visual effects for its world building, it's not hard to imagine how the bill really adds up. It's such a big show to shoot. The infamous Battle of the Bastards used 600 crew members, 500 extras, 160 tons of gravel, 70 horses, and 4 camera crews. This battle scene alone took 25 days to shoot. I mean, in comparison to Friends, $10 million per episode seems like a steal for the 6th and 7th seasons of Game of Thrones. Now, Succession is not at all like Friends or Game of Thrones, and it actually made me quite curious how it got to that $10 million budget. For Season 3, Jeremy Strong, Sarah Snook, and Kieran Culkin were only paid between $300,000 to $350,000 per episode, and Brian Cox earned the most at $400,000 to $500,000 per episode. Most of the scenes in Succession are just these actors with their smaller paychecks, chatting, with no wacky CGI or action sequences. And sure, they are wearing really nice clothing, are driven around in fancy cars, and it's all set in mansions and lavish locations. But it still seems very far away from costing the same amount as an episode in the 6th season of Game of Thrones. And then I stumbled upon this interview with Sarah Snook, Matthew Macfadyen, and the show's director Mark Mylod, where they discuss shooting the last scene of Season 3. And Sarah Snook says this.
There's a lot of pressure, I guess, to get it right. And so we'd scheduled to shoot it over 2 days, unfortunately with a weekend in between, which was going to be difficult.
It took 2 whole days, with a weekend in between, to shoot that last admittedly iconic scene in Season 3 that ended up lasting approximately 8 minutes in the final edit. I mean, that definitely explains why Succession cost so much money to produce. It's not an expensive cast, and it's definitely not the visual effects either. Instead, Succession costs so much money because of their dedication to getting it right. The show takes months to shoot in various locations, meaning not only do you have to fly the actors and crew members over to the different places, but also once they get there, everyone hunkers down for weeks at a time to get an episode out. As an example, the wedding at the end of season 1 was shot at Eastnor Castle, 120 miles outside of London, and the 350-person cast and crew team stayed in the area for almost 8 weeks. In comparison, most TV dramas only take 8 to 12 days of filming per episode. Of course, these posh locations that the cast and crew are getting comfortable in for weeks at a time cost lots of money. The cost to stay in one of those Italian villas from the end of season 3 is $100,000 per week. And at minimum, given they stayed in the Eastnor Castle area for almost 8 weeks, HBO must have rented the Italian villas for 8 or more weeks, and the cast and crew would have stayed in the area for the same amount of time. Just to note, if you're starting to add up the numbers, you'll notice that with the actor salaries and the location budget, the last 2 episodes are starting to cost more than $10 million. The $10 million per episode number is an average. I assume the earlier episodes in the season cost a lot less, so that they could make room in the budget for the last 2 episodes. $10 million for 3 very different shows. Sometimes when we hear about budgets of films and TV shows, we know abstractly that it's a lot of money, but breaking it down this way and understanding why it's $10 million per episode really shines a light on the amount of effort it takes to create amazing masterpieces that we end up somehow watching in our tiny screens at home. I'm so excited to see what comes next for the Roy family in the final season of Succession, and I'm willing to bet that every dollar spent will be worth it for us fans of the show. Thanks for watching, and let me know what you think about these big budget shows in the comments. And also, are you as excited as I am for the last season of Succession? If you like this video, please give me a like and subscribe for more spiels in the future.
The ring, L to the OG, dude be the OG, A and he playing, make some noise!